Right, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Hello. If we could have a little bit of quiet, please. Right, welcome to today's meeting of the Adults Communities Overview and Scrutiny Committee. I'd like to remind everyone present this meeting will be broadcast live via the County Council's website and will also be available for viewing after the meeting. Can I ask you to ensure that mobile phones are switched to silent? Can everyone please switch their microphone on when speaking and turn it off when finishing speaking? I have received apologies from Mrs. Fryer with Mrs. Seaton as her substitute, and I'd also like to welcome Mukesh to his first meeting here, I believe, as the representative of Health Watch, who's taken over from Michael Smith, I understand, for the future going forward. So welcome, Mukesh. It's a very pleasure to see you here today. So the first thing we have are the minutes held of the meeting held on the 20th of January. Are people comfortable they are a true record? All in favour? Thank you. Agenda item 2, question time. I've received no questions from members of the public. Agenda item 3, there are no questions being raised under Standing Order 7.3 or 7.5. Agenda item 4, I've not been notified of any agenda items other than the items on the agenda. Declarations of interest. Do any members have any declarations of interest not already notified? Other than those of being obviously for those that are also district councillors. No, thank you. We have no declarations of the party whip. And under agenda item 7, we've received no petitions under Standing Order 36. So we're moving on to agenda item 8, which will be a presentation on residential and nursing care for older people. And I'd like to welcome Sandy McMillan, the Assistant Director, and Matt Williams, the business partner, who will give the presentation.
Thank you, Chair. This is the first time, I think, that we've done a presentation in this kind of format to the committee. So I think we're quite interested to see how it goes. So it would be useful to get some feedback from the committee as to whether this is a useful way for us to convey information to you. The presentation that we're going to give follows a discussion which took place previously in the committee, most recently in November, in relation to a report you received on the target operating model. And there was a request that we would provide yourselves with a further breakdown of a range of data regarding permanent care for older people. And I think we've probably had quite a lot of latitude in terms of what we're going to bring back to you. So again, it'd be useful to get some feedback as to whether this really kind of satisfies the kind of queries that you'd had. And we're certainly happy to deal with any questions that you might have at the end of the presentation. But what we're going to focus on during the presentation is the numbers and breakdown of the people who live in residential care homes, some issues about the quality of care in those care homes, and the numbers of people being placed. So both the numbers of people who are there, but the number of people who are being placed by the council, and some information about how Leicestershire compares to other local authorities. I'm going to be at a slight disadvantage when I do this because the presentation's behind me. So I'll do my best to make sure I'm on the right slide as we go through. So this first slide outlines some information about the people who are currently over 65, who are currently in care homes in Leicestershire. And the chart shows how these people are distributed across the district and borough areas within the county. So each bar shows by district or borough the number, and the darker colour is for those people who are in residential care, and the lighter bar for those who are in nursing care, and just shows the overall number of care homes per district. So, for instance, in Charnwood there are 23 residential care homes and 10 nursing homes. And overall across the whole county there are 89 residential homes and 30 nursing homes. Now the difference between a residential home and a nursing home is broadly the type of care that's provided, and they are registered as such through the Care Quality Commission. So a residential care home provides personal care and support for people, and a nursing home, in addition to providing personal care and support, provides care that has to be overseen by a qualified nurse, not necessarily delivered by a qualified nurse, but overseen by a qualified nurse. And there are, relative to other areas, fewer nursing homes per head in Leicestershire than in many other areas. So and that's a historic issue, and there are fewer people in nursing care than there are in many other areas. So there are obviously significantly more residential homes in Leicestershire than there are nursing homes. Some of those homes are dual registered. Some homes are both registered as residential care homes and nursing homes, so there'll be some people within those homes who are receiving only residential care, and there'll be some people who are receiving nursing care. In terms of the number of people who are within homes, at the beginning of January this year, there were 1,691 people in residential care or residential nursing care, and there's a bit more later on about how those numbers have changed over time. But that's actually the number of people who are supported by the county council. There are actually more people who are either self-funded or funded by others, by the NHS or other local authorities. But in terms of local authority funded care, probably is about a third of people in care homes who are funded by the council. But the chart here is not showing that breakdown between self-funders and council funded care. It's to show the difference between the numbers of people who are supported in 24-hour care settings and residential care compared to the number of people who are supported in community settings. So there's a total of about 5,000 people who are supported by adult social care by the council, and about a third of those are in residential care, and about 2/3 of those are in community settings, mostly living within their own home. And that's very much part of our strategy, is to support as many people as possible in their own homes. And over time, that's something that we want to do more of. We're not seeking to have proportionally more people in residential care. We want more people to be living at home. So in terms of the kind of characteristics of the people who live in residential care, this is just providing a breakdown by age, gender, and the reasons why people are supported in residential care. So again, these are just for people aged over 65. You can see from the bar chart, so that by age, they're split into 3 age categories. People aged between 65 and 74, people between 75 and 84, and people who are 85 and over. And you can see from that the largest group is for people 85 and over. The great majority of people are aged over 75. And in terms of by gender, it's pretty much 70-30 in relation to 70% women and 29% men. And that's just really a product of age.
And for people viewing this on the video, they're only seeing you, but not that slide. Are they seeing the slide as well?
Yeah, it's just the video here isn't the same as what's on there.
Ah, that's helpful. Thank you.
Thank you for that. So the split is just really a factor. The fact that women have a greater life expectancy. So because the great majority of people are aged over 75, there's proportionately more women. Increasingly, the population of people in care homes is getting older, and people are by and large there because of increased frailty. Now, the third bar chart, which is the one at the bottom of the slide, is an attempt to show the reasons why people are placed within residential care. What I'd say is this is probably the least reliable piece of data here, because in reality, most people are in residential care for multiple reasons. So if you're looking at people who have got multiple long-term health conditions, people who are very frail, it's very hard, I think, sometimes to identify what's the primary reason why they're there. They're there because of multiple reasons, because of age-related frailty. But I think it probably provides a little bit of useful information just to give some kind of context of what the balance of needs of people are, is really outlined here. So the greatest reason is for people who require physical support. So this will generally be in relation to personal care needs. So people who might need help with washing, dressing, eating. The second most common reason is to do with either mental health support or cognition. I think that's probably quite difficult, to differentiate between what's a mental health issue and what's an issue in relation to cognition and memory, which is really dementia. In reality, these things are probably quite mixed up, actually, in some ways. But that's the second most common reason, is people, because of their mental health, because of dementia, require support. Then there'll be physical issues to do with mobility. So some people may not be mobile and may require large amounts of care because they're not mobile. And then there's the relation to learning disability support, social support, are then the more minor reasons. But the major reasons are rather to do with physical needs or mental health or dementia needs. In terms of the numbers of people in permanent care, what you've got here is something which is showing what the resident population of people is. So this is not to do with admissions, this is to do with the total number of people who the council is supporting at any one time in residential care. And you can see from the line that essentially the number, this is from the period from, for a 3-year period from January 17 to January 20. The number is pretty static. So the number has been really about between 16 and 1700 for that whole period. So really relatively little changed. However, in that period, there's been a rise in the number of older people in the general population in Leicestershire. So if you were to look at it in terms of the expected numbers of people you would see in residential care based on the increase in population, has actually risen by 4.2%. So there are 4.2% more older people in that 3-year period. So the proportion of people actually within residential care has reduced by about 3.6% in that period, if you look at it as a per head calculation. So at that point, I'm now going to hand over to Matt Williams, who's going to take you through, I think, some of the more technical details in relation to the people. So I'll hand over to Matt now.
Thank you, Sandy. Good afternoon, all. Okay, as Sandy has explained, I'm going to go into a bit more detail, and I've got a bit of an overview there of numbers in residential nursing care and the change over time. I'm just going to delve now into a bit more information in that area. So the first chart that you can see at the top there breaks down the age groups over time. So still over the last 3 years, but we're looking at the top line there, which is the number of people aged 85 or over in permanent care, and the second line, running from 220 to 266, is the number aged 65 to 74. And what we're starting to do here is look at the age profile and the change over time. And clearly from this chart we can see that we've had a 9% reduction in those aged 85 and over, whilst having a 21% increase in those aged 65 to 74, the lower age group of the bracket. So the bottom chart attempts to delve into that 65 to 74 age group and try and understand a bit more about their needs, their care needs. Sandy's already explained to an extent that it's very complicated to capture people's primary needs. People often have multiple needs, but we have to record once the way our reporting is set up. So the blue line at the top there, which is points out the learning disability on this second chart, shows a rise from 42 people in permanent care back in January 2017 up to 52 in the most recent January. Unsure clearly about why that might be. We know that life expectancy of people with learning disabilities is increasing, and that could potentially be having an impact. And it's a similar position, I guess, for the second line, the gold-coloured line there, we can see has risen from 12 to 31 over that 3-year period. Now, these are people with memory and cognition as their primary support need. And again, Sandy noted in an earlier slide that difficulty in between trying to record whether people have a more generic mental ill health or whether they have something around memory and cognition. It's a new area of recording over the last few years within social care, so again we have to take that into account. There may be a greater prevalence of early onset dementia. We know that gets talked about in research and in the media. It's too early to say. I'd say at this stage, over a 3-year period like that with recording, I'd say it's too early. But clearly, by looking at it, we are seeing a shifting pattern in the age ranges of people in permanent care at any given time. Sorry, the charts might get a bit...
There were percentages, weren't they? You were quoting.
Yes, you've got percentages on the side here, and these are actual numbers of people in permanent care. Sorry. Excuse me. So, sorry, charts getting perhaps a little bit more complicated as I go into it. What we're showing here, we've got a 3-year period, so we're starting from kind of January 17 on the left-hand side, running through to the more recent January on the far side. We're looking at people with a primary support need of physical disability and those that are aged 85 or over. So they were some of the more common characteristics that we saw in one of the earlier slides. And what this chart is trying to show is a shift in way that people are supported of this age group and of these people's support needs. So the blue line at the top, which has got a slight downward trend, is showing a reduction in the number of people living in permanent residential or nursing care. Whilst the gold line, which has got an upward trend, are those that have been supported to live in their own homes. And that's primarily through home care visits and so forth. So one's coming down, one's going up, and we can see from around about March last year, about 12 months ago, that the use of home care to support people of this age, 85 and over, with physical disabilities, people are starting to be supported at home more than perhaps in residential or nursing care on a permanent basis. Clearly, it's only just started to become the more primary support setting. We'll have to watch how that goes, but as pointed out by Sandy, that's kind of a strategic direction for the authority in supporting people in this way in their home. Excuse me. I won't dwell on this chart. You've probably seen more exciting charts than this one. This is trying to look at the kind of length of placement. So if we look at people on the first of each month, how long have they been in permanent care? There is little variation over the 3 years. What we're seeing there is that on average, people are in their care placement for 2 years, 11 months at any one time that we look at the population. What we're going to do here with this chart then is trying to put into context how Leicestershire compares to other authorities and around the country. We often compare ourselves to 15 other similar authorities, generally shire authorities. And this is based on information published by NHS Digital last autumn. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at how many people are in permanent care in Leicestershire. And this is taken from March last year. It's the latest published information. So how many people in Leicestershire are in permanent care and how many in each of the other authorities are done so. We show it as a rate per 100,000 population because it's the only way we can compare, because clearly some authorities are larger than others, so we do a rate. And you can see the horizontal line there is the average of these authorities. Leicestershire being slightly lower. I think we're ranked fifth lowest. Yeah, fifth lowest. The average is 1,262, again, per 100,000 population, and the Leicestershire figure is 1,191, so slightly lower. If we were to look at, I haven't done a chart for this one, but if we were also to look at the East Midlands, so we're bringing in unitary authorities there, Leicester, Derby, Nottingham, etc. But within the East Midlands region, we are again lower than the average of that group of authorities. I'm just going to turn our attention then to the work of the Care Quality Commission, the CQC. They clearly undertake inspections of residential homes, nursing homes, as well as domiciliary care. And their inspections, their views, they're then categorised into four distinct classifications for those providers. That might be inadequate, requires improvement, is good or outstanding. And in October last year, the Care Quality Commission published their report, The State of Healthcare and Adult Social Care in England. And from that, some of this information then we're looking at is taken. So the top chart there compares Leicestershire's situation with our residential nursing providers between 2018 and 2019. In Leicestershire, 3/4 of our residential nursing providers are classified as being good. And that's a small reduction from 79% the previous year. For those requiring improvement, slightly to the left of centre there on the top chart, there's been a shift from 10% in 2018 to 20% in 2019. However, there are no providers rated as inadequate in 2019, and 1% were rated as outstanding. Compared to similar shire authorities, as again we've done previously, this is the bottom chart on the slide. Very similar in terms of those rated as good. The 76% in Leicestershire rates compared to 74% in other authorities. We are slightly higher in terms of those requiring improvement. 19.7% compared to 17% amongst similar authorities. However, as explained earlier, we have no inadequate rated homes. I think it's 2% amongst other authorities, and we have 1% is outstanding, slightly higher amongst other authorities at 5%.
Looking at the middle paragraph of CQC criteria,
Yes, yeah.
around lines of inquiry around diversity.
Oh, sorry, that's it. Mine off.
Working.
Try that.
You mentioned data collection around gender and age earlier on. In relation to that middle paragraph there, with the focus on equality diversity, do you collect information about disability, sexual orientation or ethnicity with regard to the data that you highlighted earlier on?
Yes, many of the protected characteristics are held on our main client database. Not all of them are reported nationally. Some are, some aren't. But yes, we do capture characteristics such as that. Yeah.
Sorry, could I just ask something relating to that one? How many care providers do we deal with in this area, Leicestershire?
Residential and nursing.
The care providers, yes, please.
No, that's okay. Yeah, there are currently 119 care homes for people aged 65 or over in Leicestershire, which is the age group we're working with on this slide deck.
Can I just clarify that one? That's care homes within Leicestershire. There clearly are, we place people outside of Leicestershire too. So, for instance, we place quite a number of people in the city of Leicester. For many people, that's actually more convenient than another location within the county. And we can place people in any local authority in England. So the number of homes we actually contract with and have placements with would be higher than that. I mean, obviously it varies because we're making new placements all the time, but I think it would probably twice that number of homes that we actually place people in. Having said that, not quite a number of those will just be single placements. The great majority of people we would place locally.
So sticking with the classifications of inspections from CQC, next two slides, I'm not quite sure how useful they are. I've pulled them from the CQC website to have a little look at. Trying to show you the distribution of the homes. So the map on the left is obviously blank because, as I pointed out earlier, there were no inadequate rated homes at the time of the publication. And the map on the right-hand side shows that those that require improvement. Got a very similar slide next, and that is again the other two classifications that we've spoken about, the good and then the two homes classified as outstanding. So far I've just been touching on those number of people in permanent residential nursing care at any given time, and we've also looked at the CQC. I just want to turn our attention slightly now to the number of people being placed into permanent care during a period, so starting a new placement. The table at the top on this slide shows you, each column shows you the financial year. The final one there being the financial year 2018-2019, where we had 909 people admitted into permanent care during that year. That was a reduction from 958 the previous year, the middle column. Looking at the table below, we're getting a feel for the characteristics again of these people going into permanent care, and just that age bit that we touched on in an earlier slide. You can see that the proportion of people aged 65 to 74, 11% of admissions were of this age group back in 2016-17. That's risen to 12.4% in 2018-19. Similarly, if we look at the proportions in the bottom row of your slide deck there, we can see that those aged 85 or over have fallen from 54.5% in 2016-17 to 51.6% in 2018-19. Still with admissions, number of people admitting. This is just trying to look at Leicestershire only and look at a context over the last few years and bring into it the most recent year. So that's the financial year 2019-20 that we're in. We've clearly only got a few weeks left of that being early March. So you can see from this chart that we peaked in 2017-18 with 958 admissions. Our expectations for this year are that we'll have somewhere in the region of 880 admissions. Still a few weeks to go, etc. But that's where we estimate that the number of admissions will be for this year. If this is the case, then you can clearly see a downward trend over the last 3 years, taking us in the direction we wish to go, supporting people to live at home as opposed to residential or nursing care. And finally, in terms of admissions, we return to how do we compare to other authorities. So it's a similar style chart that we had in a few slides back, in that we're showing it as a rate per 100,000 population. You can see, compared to the average line, the average horizontal line there, that Leicestershire in 2018-19, it's the last year we have published data for from NHS Digital, we are slightly higher than the average of similar authorities. It is worth noting that compared to the East Midlands, as a region, we are slightly lower. So I think the average in these Midlands is something like 610, whereas we're at 575.6, so slightly lower. And we're reasonably in line with the national picture. I think the national picture is around about 579 per 100,000 compared to our 575, so just slightly lower. And I think it's worth noting that over about the last 4 years or so, the number of admissions in Leicestershire has fluctuated slightly higher, slightly lower than the national picture. Sometimes we're in the bottom half, sometimes just in the top half. So we're very similar, very close, either slightly above or below. I think I'm going to hand over to Sandy just for one final slide for you.
Okay. Final slide is about what we pay in terms of weekly costs for a residential care placement. The first thing to note is these are the figures, comparative figures for 2018-19. It's the latest year that we've got comparable data from other authorities. We significantly uprated our fees last year. So I would expect that when we have the comparable data for 19-20, our figure will have increased more than most other authorities, because we did a fundamental review of our fees and invested significant resources in that. But the position as it was in 18-19, our average cost for a care home placement was £593. That's an average of payments for older people. Clearly, there were payments that were higher than that for people with higher levels of need, and that's also averaging out residential nursing care. Nursing care is in part paid for by the NHS, where there's a contribution towards nursing care. So the total amount received by the care homes, by the nursing homes, would be higher in result of that. And it also doesn't include money that was paid for third-party top-ups by relatives. So that's just the contribution paid by the council, which shows that compared to other East Midlands authorities, we were slightly below the average. But as I'd anticipate, that position would have changed in the result of the fee review. So I think that's the end of the slides that we prepared. I'm happy to take any questions or any feedback you might have on how useful the presentation was.
Thank you, Sandy and Matt. Do I have any questions? Ted?
Could we have that copy for us to peruse in more greater detail?
I understand that this is now published and is with the papers. Is that right?
Mr. Crooks?
Yeah, you said about placing residents outside of Leicestershire. Is that because of their wishes, or is that because of capacity issues?
No, it's driven very much by choice and appropriateness of placement, and actually people have a right to choose. So unlike some other areas, if people want to choose a care home, they can, and the council will pay that if that cost is in line with the council's usual costs for paying for care, or if it's not, if the people are prepared to pay a third-party top-up, then they can choose a home. And by and large, if a home is made outside the area, it's usually for the fact that people want to choose to do that. So, for instance, if someone wanted their mother to live with them and they'd moved out of the area and they lived in Manchester, the placement could be made in Manchester, and we would arrange to make that placement for them. We'd make the arrangements to place them in that area. I think, as I said previously, that there's also, if people live near the boundaries of Leicestershire, it may well be more convenient for them to choose a home that is over the geographical boundary. That's going to be particularly the case for people living in and around the city of Leicester. May well be appropriate for them to choose to live in a home in Leicestershire. But if we're placing some distance away, it would nearly always be because of people's choice. There are significant numbers of vacancies of homes. Last time we did a kind of audit of that, we found that there was more than 300 placement vacancies available within Leicestershire. So it isn't driven by a lack of vacancies. It's driven by choice and appropriateness of care for people.
Mrs. Broadley.
Thank you. Is that also the same for adults with learning disabilities, that it's they're out of county? That isn't through capacity as it is, I'm asking if it's the same thing.
The presentation day has just been about really older people's care. So we haven't really looked at the issues for younger adults, where I think that there are some significant differences in relation to the type of care that's available. And certainly there are a number of different reasons why younger people might be placed in homes outside of Leicestershire. I think if you've got people who may have lived in residential colleges, quite often they will want to carry on living in that area where they may well actually have lived for a period of time, and that can mean that they get placed in those areas. But also people with very specialist needs. There are a number of care homes that specialise in people with particular kinds of needs, and that may result in people being placed outside of Leicestershire. By and large, though, we do want to place people locally. We think it's important that people aren't required to move out of the area if they don't want to, and we very much want people to live locally and maintain local connections. But it is a different market in that there are a smaller proportion of people in residential care under 65. And the homes themselves are much smaller. So I think the issues around how much capacity there is and where it is slightly more complicated.
I think, as Sandy said, I mean, this wasn't the topic of the presentation. I'm loath to widen it out. What I would say is that perhaps we could have a different presentation later on the subject of adults with learning difficulties, which may be the way forward, rather than try and put the officer on the spot now for information I haven't prepared.
I actually didn't mean younger people with learning disabilities. On the slide, you showed people over 65 with a learning disability, and that's what I meant, the people over 65. Your information about people under 65 was very useful, but that wasn't actually, I wasn't broadening the thing.
Fine.
Yes, so sorry, I slightly misunderstood your question. What we've included here are where there are older people effectively who are placed in older people services. So there are some people with learning disabilities who are placed in homes for older people. And that very often is an appropriate thing to do, because if a frail person with learning disabilities actually may receive the care they need in a home that's aimed for older people rather than with younger people with learning disabilities. And by and large, I don't think there's any reason why people whose primary reason for care is around kind of age-related frailty should receive that kind of care locally, and I don't think we've found that difficult to source locally.
Mrs. Wright.
Is it fair to assume, or do you anticipate the trend continuing to go down, particularly for residential care, so the numbers admitted to residential care, with a better offer for care at home? Particularly, I'm thinking of nighttime care, because a lot of people go into residential care because they can't manage at home. That seems to be the breaking point. And if we start offering that with the better offer for home care, do we anticipate that trend going down?
Yeah, I think we do anticipate that trend going down. And if you look at the number of admissions per head that are made in Leicestershire and the number which are made in the areas which are performing best or the lowest numbers, there's still quite a significant room for improvement for us to make in terms of reducing residential care admissions. But I mean, inevitably, there is a limit to that. But I think we're some way off that limit. But there comes a point where clearly people are very frail and require very high levels of support, but actually it might be very difficult and intrusive to receive that level of care. So there probably is a lower limit somewhere, but we've got a long way to go, and we could certainly, I think, make quite significant reductions in the number of people going to residential care without getting near that limit.
Mrs. Seaton.
Thank you, Chair. We know the County Council's contributions of £593 weekly towards the care. What would be the average care at home? I know it's a sliding scale, it depends on the level of care, etc., but there must be an average that's worked out.
I'm sure there is an average. I don't have that number immediately to hand. I don't know if Matt does. Well, I think I'm sure that's a number that we can find, and we'd be able to make that available. But these averages can be a bit misleading, because they're going to people who've got very high cost care, and there's no upper limit to the cost that we will pay to support somebody at home. So there are some people getting very intensive levels of support up to 24-hour care to enable people to remain at home. So there isn't any kind of arbitrary cap on that figure. So averages have got to be taken with some caution. But yeah, there will be an average figure which we could have. I know the average numbers of hours of domiciliary care that people support are around about, it's about 11 is about the average number of hours of care per week.
Thank you for that, Sandy. I think hopefully I'll conclude on behalf of the committee that the committee members were very interested in the presentation. I don't know if anyone's got any specific comments on the presentation. I found it interesting. It's always, more information is always valuable, I think, to this committee. Do any members have any specific comments about the presentation style? Is it something we would like to have further ones of on not dissimilar topics as the agenda permits? Seaton?
I didn't come to the briefing, I'm afraid, because it was so divorced from this meeting. I think if I was going to make a comment, I would like that to be closer to the meeting. Yeah.
I think had you been there this morning, you might have heard that comment. So we were discussing it this morning about the timings for the presentation. So it probably would have been sensible, we felt, perhaps to move the chairman's briefing forward, do the presentation later, and therefore condense the two for members that then only had to come in for those two, to have them closer together. So it's something that as a committee we've already started discussing with the officers for future presentations.
Of course, it's not just for the members, it's also for the people doing the briefing as well, isn't it? And coming to this meeting. Thank you.
Ted?
Yeah, to give some positive feedback, I deliberately didn't actually really look at the slides. I just listened to Sandy or yourself, and I noticed that the points were very well and clearly covered. But it's hence the first question I asked about when one has time to look at it in more detail. But actually, the core elements were actually verbally just passed through, so I did find that incredibly useful, thank you, without the need to actually look at the slides.
So I think it's a thank you from us. I think we enjoyed the presentation, we enjoyed the format and the style. I think if members have got any similar presentations they want, if they can either come to me as chairman or go through their own group spokespeople if they prefer, and then we could look at this at future agenda planning items. But as I said, I think it's information that has been very useful to us, so thank you very much for that. Right, we should now move on to agenda item 9, which is progress on the decommissioning of the Care Online service, which again this committee asked for at a previous meeting for an update. I'd like to welcome Nigel Thomas, who we all know, as well as Miriam McKee from Enrich. Thank you, Miriam, for taking the time to come here to give us an update. And I think you're the one that's doing the presentation, so we're in your capable hands, so unless Nigel's starting off.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. So the purpose of this brief report is to provide an update, as you said, on the progress made with the transition of the Care Online service to Enrich Connect, which took place early last year. You remember that Care Online originally sat within the Communities and Wellbeing Service, and it was a non-statutory service, and its aim was to support people with use of IT to maintain their independence. And it targeted people, not exclusively, but did target mainly people with disabilities. The background of the previous decisions are contained in your report. But after a period of consultation, it was advised that at the time the Care Online service was not viable in its then present form. The review identified a number of other third-party organisations that, whilst not operating a like-for-like service, could offer support with IT needs. And in addition, £10,000 of transitional funding over 2 years were made available for groups to develop their offer. Following the application process for the funds and through further analysis of the groups that we engaged with, Enrich themselves were successful in securing the funding. They'd previously been successful in securing big lottery funding, and they were interested in establishing a similar organisation called Enrich Connect. And paragraph 13 gives some background to the service that was set up, and Miriam, I'm sure, will add any more detail. Paragraphs 16 to 20 just set out briefly the progress made. Staff have continued to offer one-to-one support for people requesting digital assistance or have been referred to other stakeholders. During the first 3 months of operation, Enrich managed the transfer of those Care Online service users who requested continued support into the new arrangements, and they've enrolled 77 service users, received 58 inquiries and provided 174 home training visits, although Miriam may update that information. It's currently averaging around 10 new referrals a month, and as of January, Enrich had made 888 visits to clients and responded to 242 general phone inquiries. So we feel that that transition has been successful. Enrich Connect has certainly made positive progress in the establishment of a service which has made sure that the clients of the old Care Online service has been able to continue to be supported by experienced staff in meeting their digital requirements. I'm going to hand over to Miriam now, who is closer to the business since its transfer.
I'm chair of Enrich, so I get involved at a relatively high level, as you can imagine. Since we took over the service, we started operations in February of last year. By December, we actually had 160 people who we were actually helping. That's now reached nearly 200. We do a tremendous amount of one-to-one support, but we are now developing group support. We started that with a residential home, not a residential home, an older people sheltered housing in Mount Sorrel, which was incredibly successful. I've now contacted Hinckley and Bosworth County Council. They have 11 sheltered housing, so we're actually going to be taking the service into there. We also want to go next one, North West Leicestershire, and then into Melton Mowbray area. Melton Mowbray area has been identified by the big lottery as an area of particular need. So we're developing the system to try and get greater outreach, and by doing outreach in groups we can actually touch a greater number of people. That doesn't mean to say we're not still going to continue with the one-to-one support, because that is incredibly valuable. But we have identified different needs for different groups within the community. The group that needs the most one-to-one support is actually the younger group that we deal with, as they seem to have the greatest amount of need, because they often have multiple sclerosis or very major disabilities that actually mean that they do need very much home support. We have also recently had our big lottery review. That went well. We've also been talking to the big lottery, and I know it's a bit in the future, about what happens post the 3-year funding that we've got. We have been identifying ways in which we can actually take the service forward after the 3 years funding, and we have requested that of them, would they be interested in us putting in another bid, but different and for a smaller amount of money, because we're also developing and have been developing a volunteer side to this, so that we actually bring more resource in, not just paid resource, but non-paid resource to keep the service going. We have found that actually the service is incredibly valuable in so far as that we actually do keep people connected. It allows people to actually do their shopping, to keep in contact with families, all sorts of very small scale things, but actually are very valuable in making people part of the 21st century life. Do you have any questions of me?
Do members have any questions? Mr. Parton.
didn't press it hard enough. The number of clients and phone call inquiries seems to be more than when the service was in-house. I looked at the web page on the County Council, and it would indicate that you have taken this forward more because the numbers are more than the stated on the County Council's website, or admittedly for a couple of years ago.
We actually, when we took the service on, one of the things that we actually said to the big lottery was that we would actually take the service forward. We have actually gone out to a whole variety of other organisations that deals with people with disabilities, also age issues, to actually tell them about our service. We've also had something like 70 people have actually come to us requesting the service. Because we actually do go out on various notice boards, etc., that people with disabilities use.
Good. Yeah, thank you.
Mrs. Wright.
How do you follow up on the outreach projects that you do? So you say you're going into sheltered housing.
Yes.
So if somebody there, it sparks an interest and they want to do more, how do you follow up on that?
Enrich is not just Enrich Connect. That is one project. We have another project which we've been going now for 35 years in Leicestershire, which is actually helping people with disabilities by providing volunteers and other support. When we went into Mount Sorrel, the other side of the charity also went in, and we set up a get-together event, and we did the computer event. Any needs that people have ongoing, they're actually part of the family, and there will be a support worker that they can contact. We don't drop people, but we don't try to make people dependent upon us either. And so we have found that we've actually got people who were with the old Care Online, say 2 years ago, now have a new need and come back to us to help them with that new particular need. But we don't try to create ongoing dependency. And one of the reasons we're trying to get volunteers is so that we can then set up a project, get people going, and then leave it to a volunteer who can come in and actually help people with their day-to-day needs. But that also then leads to other things which we like to do, which is befriending, getting people into the community and doing other activities.
Dr. Bremner.
Just a couple of questions, and thank you for coming. Is Enrich Connect a charity?
Yes. Yes, we are a charity. We were set up by Sue Ryder and Leonard Cheshire, which is why we got the name Enrich. The charity was originally set up to help people with disabilities to be able to do the things that people who are able-bodied can do. We don't dictate what people want, but we would try and find somebody, a volunteer, and match somebody's skills to them. So we have done things like help people write books. We have one gentleman who was incredibly badly disabled and only had use of one arm, but he painted with his mouth. We had a volunteer who helped him put on an art exhibition in Loughborough. So on the other side, we've always done lots of different things. And we did have some skills prior to actually winning the bid from the big lottery of helping people become digitally connected.
Second question is more financial. You have £10,000 for transition, and you've got 10,000 over 2 years. Is that your annual budget? You estimate 10,000 a year?
No, we won a big lottery bid for 3 years to manage the Connect project. Your 10,000 is on top of that, and we're going to use that to do some larger outreach things to try and get a bigger footprint in the community.
Do you use, I don't know if in the sector whether they're commercial or work with charities, but fundraisers? Because big lottery may not be sustainable. So there must be other sources of fundraising that you use.
For the other, The Connect project is, because it's a big lottery project, is separate to the other side of our business. Yes, we fundraise, and we fundraise quite a lot. We're actually a relatively small charity, but we have been fundraising now for 35 years within Leicestershire. We have a fairly big footprint of lots of people supporting us on small scales. We've also from time to time done the bigger scale putting in for bids, and at the moment, because we have 2 years, we're also looking at other people who might support us on this computer side once, if big lottery money didn't come forward. But as I say, we've already started discussions about potentially getting another big lottery fund.
Mr. Lickrish.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. It's only to say this, that I had a couple of residents who were with the Care Online, and then the takeover by Enrich just seems to have been seamless to me, and the takeover was brilliant, and it eliminated all the concerns that these residents had. So just say well done with the takeover, and may it last.
Thank you very much indeed.
Right, no further questions. Thank you, Nigel, and especially thanks to Miriam for coming. I think that's really given us a good view of what you've done, and I think I'd like to thank you on behalf of not just this committee, but I'm sure the majority, or I'm sure all of the County Council, for the work you're doing and the work you've done to enable this service to continue and in fact be expanded. So thank you very much. Now moving on to agenda item 10, which is the use of resources in adult social care, pages 17 to 88, which is with John.
Thank you, Chair. So this is a report which details the findings of the Local Government Association report on the use of resources in adult social care. The Local Government Association have put together a range of information from different sources, mainly around NHS Digital. So it brings together finance information with performance information to give an overview of each local authority's use of resources. It's not necessarily an indication of quality, it's not necessarily an indication of efficiency or effectiveness, and there are a number of caveats which are highlighted at paragraph 7 of the report. But what it does do is it gives, for the first time really, an overview of a combination of different forms of information, and it allows authorities to be kind of compared one against another to aid thinking around adult social care. So this is based on 1819 information, which is the latest information we've got. There'll be a further report in November this year, which will have 1920 information. What we've got in the report is just a summary of the findings and then a little bit of analysis around that to aid thinking and aid discussion. So overall, what we see in a national level is that spending on adult social care has increased nationally by about 4% per annum. That's consistent with previous years. 4 to 5% is the sort of average increase in spending on adult social care. Interestingly, a higher increase in spending on younger adults, and by that I mean 18 to 64, rather than older adults. So the increase in cost and spend for older adults is 3%, and for younger adults it's 4.7%. So the report provides information about Leicestershire, benchmarked against the All England average and against comparator authorities, and the comparator authorities are those that are used by SIPFA, which we use for our performance benchmarking. So to begin, the first thing to say is that Leicestershire has overall the 5th lowest spend on adult social care per adult. The report has 2 different ways of measuring spend. It does it by spend per adult, which is essentially saying the total amount that we spend in Leicestershire on adult social care divided by the total number of people over the age of 18. And then there's a second measure, which is spend per client, which is the total amount that we spend on adult social care divided by the total number of clients that we serve. So it's slightly two different measures. You just need to be watchful about which one we're using it and talking about at any one time. But in terms of spend per adult, we have the 5th lowest spend on adult social care nationally. And within that, what you will see is that we have the 2nd lowest spend on long-term care, with an average spend on short-term care. And that's probably a feature of the work we've been doing over the last few years around promoting independence and trying to prevent delay people going into longer-term care services. So the spend on older adults per adult is the lowest in the country. Spend on older adults when compared to other authorities is not only the lowest in the country, but we actually spend 43% less than the average for all councils and 27% less than our nearest neighbour councils. So it's considerably lower spend in Leicestershire than in other areas of the country. If we look at spend per client, what we see is that Leicestershire is about 136 out of 152. So a slightly higher spend per client than spend per adult. And that's true also for younger adults 18 to 64. In terms of the numbers of people that we support, in terms of demand, we have a slightly higher number of requests, and it's particularly older adults where we have a higher number of requests than comparator authorities. But equally, if you look at the numbers of people who are actually supported in the population, the figures, we don't necessarily support a higher number of people. So we have higher numbers of requests, but we don't necessarily support a higher number of people. So what you might take from that is that one or two things. One, we are applying eligibility criteria in the same way that others are. So it doesn't matter about the number of requests, but the actual number of people supported is about average, and therefore you could argue that we apply eligibility fairly and consistently. And you might also take from that our front door services, in terms of the initial conversations and the initial assessments that people are having, are working as they should. The User Resources Report also considers a couple of indicators around promoting independence, and the two that it looks at particularly are direct payments, where we have 49% of people on direct payments, and we're the 2nd highest in the country, and the percentage of people with learning disabilities living in settled accommodation, where we rank about 55 out of 152, so we're about in the sort of top third or so. And again, you've already had a conversation today around residential care, and these figures just bear out what was in the presentation. So for older adults, our rates of admission are 76 out of 152, absolutely bang average in the middle. So there are 75 authorities who have lower rates of admission than us, and there are 75 or so, or however many. I don't know, the numbers are completely wrong there, but you understand the point I'm making. I'm getting up to 220 authorities by the time I finish, won't I? But we are absolutely in the middle in terms of admissions to residential care at the moment. In terms of cost, and again, had some of this conversation already around fees, what the report shows is that we have an average cost of home care in Leicestershire. Bearing in mind this is based on 18-19 figures. So we've got an average cost of home care, and we have a slightly lower cost for residential and nursing care. But of course, subsequent to the fee review that we instigated last year, those costs will have gone up for residential and nursing care. And because of the re-procurement exercise that we're doing in home care this year, the fees for home care will also increase this year. So our cost of care is going to increase this year. And the final area in terms of summary analysis is around income. What the report shows is that Leicestershire has a higher level of income, top quartile income, compared to other authorities. That's partly to do with efficiency. It's partly about the amount of income that you can collect, but it's also obviously connected to relative affluence. So if you have a relatively affluent population, you will collect more income than if you don't. So moving on to some of the analysis, some of it we've already touched on, but just to reiterate, Leicestershire has the lowest spending power, as we know, compared to other authorities, and therefore you would expect that adult social care, along with other services that the council runs and operates and commissions, would be lower than other authorities, because we obviously work to our bottom line and to our budgets. Spend on services for people over 65 is the lowest of all local authorities, and the difference is increasing, which is an interesting point to make. So whilst other authorities' costs for older adults have been going up, Leicestershire's haven't, and therefore that gap has got bigger. Factors affecting spend on older adults, the two biggest factors tend to be either demography, i.e. the number of older adults in the population, or deprivation. If you look at the numbers of people who are over the age of 65 in Leicestershire, compare that to all England, compare it to our comparator authorities, we have a slightly lower number of people over 65 against comparator authorities, against other shire councils. But we have a much higher level against the All England figure. It doesn't appear that demography is having a very big impact because, as we've already said, the number of requests from older adults is high compared to others, although the overall number of older adults is lower in the population. But actually, when we turn that into the numbers of clients served, we don't see a difference. And equally, if you look at the population of 18 to 64s, our proportion is higher in Leicestershire than in other areas, but we don't see that in terms of the numbers of people in receipt of services. So there doesn't appear to be an issue about demography in the report. Deprivation, on the other hand, does appear to be having an impact. So as I said, Leicestershire's considerably lower level of deprivation than the national average, and is potentially lower than some of our comparator councils, and that does seem to be influencing the proportion of people who receive services, partly because a lot of people fund their own care in Leicestershire, and that therefore has an impact, and partly because we have a very high income collection, and that's also to do with levels of deprivation. The fact that Leicestershire's spend per client is higher than, proportionally higher than the spend per person, might suggest that we are continuing to meet people's needs in Leicestershire. So we spend, if you look at the two measures side by side, although we have the absolute lowest spend on older adults, the spend per client, if you just look at the clients rather than the total population, is slightly higher, and therefore we are spending higher than our per person proportion would equate to. That could just mean that we have possibly a lower level of personal budget than other authorities. So we don't spend as much on people. We spend on the same number of people, but we don't spend as much on them, on each individual person. We appear to have a higher number of requests, as we've said. The report, if you go into the detail of the report, does then start to go down into what happened next after the person contact, so what we call sequels to request for services. I think it's fair to say that once you get into that level of detail, comparability becomes much more difficult because different authorities start to measure differently in terms of, let's see what happened next bits. It's once you get beyond the top level figures, it's more difficult to compare one authority to another. But there is an indication in there that Leicestershire provides higher levels of low-level ongoing support and lower levels of long-term support and long-term care and short-term care than other authorities, and that might be a reason why we have a lower level of spend. The report talks about the success we've had in promoting independence, as we've said. I think what comes out of the report is that over the last few years, Leicestershire has managed demand in a way in which has meant that the growth that we put into the MTFS every year has gone down each year. So each year, 4 years ago, we had £24 million worth of growth in the MTFS. This year, we're going into a year where we've got £9 million worth of growth in terms of demographic growth. So I think that what comes through the report is that the way that we've been managing services has managed those budget pressures from demography. I think it's probably also worth saying that looking at the MTFS, if we are to think about where we might want to make further savings going forward, we might want to think about the 18 to 64 age group rather than the over 65s, because there is obviously a level at which services become much more difficult to provide and continue to meet need depending on levels of spend, and therefore perhaps there's an indication there that we need to look at 18 to 64s rather than over 65s. Interestingly, the current MTFS, the biggest element of saving in the current MTFS is the target operating model. As a committee have had previous reports which have got a £6 million saving against it, and the majority of that saving is against older adults, not against younger adults. So we will continue through that process to take further spending out of older adult services, albeit that will be offset to some degree by the higher cost of care because of the fee increases that we've discussed. So I think that's probably all I wanted to say, Chair. I invite comments and thoughts from committee about the report itself and about the analysis.
Thanks, John. Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Chair. I think it's a report of this type from the Local Government Association, who are looking from the outside in and looking at all councils with the same sight, I should say, is welcome actually, but it might be uncomfortable reading, and I think John's been very open and honest about some of the contents in there. And there's two things, Chair, that strike me. First one is if you look on page 49, 53 or 57 on any of those bar charts there, if you look at Leicestershire and the total amount of no services provided from people contacting us is significantly higher than any other authority or comparative authority if you look at total for England as well. And that concerns me is because obviously people are requesting services and they're being turned away. And then also, if you look on page 61, and these are just the 2 points, there's lots of points that could be made, is that if you look at how much we spend on per person and the total, it's 35% less than the total for spent in England. And that's a significant gap. And I can understand if it was a 5% or a 10% gap, but 35% I think is far too much. And I understand care in different areas cost different amounts of money, but I would have thought that gap would have been a bit smaller, and we would be spending more on people. And those are the 2 points I want to make, because there's lots to be made. I'm sure the committee members will come in, but it does concern me that a lot of people are asking the county council for help, and they're being turned away without any help at all.
Yes, it is interesting, isn't it? When you talk about people being turned away without any help. So, as I said in the report, in the initial introduction, once you get underneath the high-level figures, it becomes very difficult to compare. So where we've put no services, other councils have put signposting, or they've put something else, and it's a factor and a feature of the way that people record onto the system. And the system, like all systems, you can only report what's inputted, and re-input in a way which leads the system to say no services. So I think it's something we're thinking about and something we're looking at, because actually most of those people will have had signposting, they will have had alternative services, they will have had some form of resolution to the issue with which they approach the county council. It's not just a case of saying, I'm sorry, you're not eligible, goodbye. So I think we do need to think about that. I think the other issue which this particular area is highlighting is, as we nationally move adult social care into a space where we're trying to develop strengths-based approaches and asset-based approaches to adult social care, so building on the strengths of individuals, helping people to become more resilient, looking at what's available in the community to support people, inevitably what that means is that fewer people will go on to receive long-term services. It doesn't mean that people aren't being supported, it doesn't mean that people aren't being connected into their communities or that people aren't being enabled to live more independently, but it just means that they won't get formal services, and therefore the number of people that contact local authorities and then don't go on to receive a service reduces. Now nationally that's seen as being a good thing, but then if you look at reports like this, it looks like, well, why were so many people not getting a service? Well, it's because we're trying to work to people's strengths and build on community assets. In terms of the spending gap, yes, absolutely. I think that one of the things that this report's, the starkest thing in this report is that difference in spend. It is mainly due to the fact that Leicestershire is funded to a lower degree than other authorities. So, you know, if you look at an authority, we've got neighbouring authorities that get £70 per head more than we get in Leicestershire per adult. We've got councils in the south and southeast of the country and in London that are getting £170 per adult per head population more than Leicestershire. And what that means is that inevitably those councils will spend more because they get more. Whether that's a good thing, I'll leave to debate. I think it, certainly in terms of are we meeting need, it appears that we are with the money that we've got. I think we probably meet people's basic personal needs, and we don't necessarily meet perhaps other quality of life areas that perhaps other councils do because they can, because they've got more money. But, you know, that's part of a political debate, which is not for me to have, really, I suppose.
I think, no other questions? I think, John, I don't know if you agree with me, I'll sort of sum this up as we're doing really well with the money we've got, making sure that we fully support those residents that need supporting under our statutory requirements. And I know from what you've said, both here and earlier, that there's other things that, if you had the money, you'd love to do to provide an enhanced service beyond the statutory requirement. So I think, thank you for the report, and I think we'll all take this away and read it in more detail and digest it. We're now moving on to the last report for this afternoon, which is the Smart Libraries Performance Review, which is pages 89 to 96, which is with John and Nigel, and I suspect John is passing this totally over to Nigel, particularly on the way he just indicated to his right.
Thank you, Chair. So the purpose of this report is to provide the committee with an update of the performance of Smart Libraries following its implementation across 14 of our 16 larger libraries in April last year. You remember that the technology enables customers to use their library card to gain entry and exit to a library and access to self-service kiosks for loaning books, paying charges, returning and renewing items. And installing the technology has enabled us to realise around £230,000 in savings towards the medium-term financial strategy, and also extend public access to 14 of our libraries by 30 hours a week, which is an increase of around 94%. The report sets out the usage of the libraries. I'm just going to summarise some of the key points and then open for questions. So nearly 9,000 library members registered for Smart Libraries in the first 6 months of its operation, and they generated some 43,000 logins to the 14 libraries. A login is when you use the card to go through the password and get into the library. And that accounts for 20% of all active library users. And an active library user is somebody that's used or borrowed a book in the last 12 months. In addition, 10,000 new people joined the library during this period, of which 1,500 or 15% became Smart Library members. The largest demographic over the 6 months has been in the 60 to 69 year age group, with the second highest demographic being 50 to 59 years. We're showing signs now in terms of the more current information is that there's been a slight increase in the lower bracket of 40 to 50 age group as people get to know about the system. But early evidence suggests that as the system's settled in, there's been a perceived increase in usage during the staffed hours. You remember that we've reallocated staffing hours to account for when those people that may not want to be a Smart Library user are more likely to use the library service. And this has been particularly prevalent in the smaller second tier of libraries, the shopping centre libraries, places like Earl Shilton, Blaby and so on. Loans across the 14 Smart Libraries declined on average by about 8%, and this was less in the larger libraries like Loughborough, for example. And we were particularly interested to look at one of our key calendar events during the year, which is a summer reading challenge, because children don't have access to a Smart Library. They have to be accompanied by an adult, and it's the adult that takes the card out. So we were particularly interested to see what the impact of that would be. And that has held steady. There has been a small decrease in book loans, but a 10% increase in children joining the library and a small increase in children completing the summer reading challenge throughout those months. Visits showed an average decline of 6%, but this varied across libraries, with Loughborough and Wigston showing visitor increases of 3% and 6% respectively. And computer use during those times saw a small increase of 1%. Elsewhere in your report, paragraphs 27 to 31 details the work that was undertaken to ensure that health and safety standards were upheld, because clearly when we were initially proposing this scheme, there were a lot of questions about how do we make sure that people are kept safe, and there's stuff in place to enable people to use the library safely. And during this period measured, the first 6 months, we've had 24 incidents that have been reported during smart hours, but non-staffed hours. This compares to 41 incidents being reported during staffed hours. And the sort of incidents have been based on maybe technology failure in the early stages, some instances of theft, but also some low-level stuff, people falling asleep in the library and then setting off the alarm when we close down. There's been a relatively small number of those. In your report, paragraph 32 to 35 gives a summary of the feedback, which was a result of some informal canvassing of customer and staff views. Positive feedback indicated that the facilities were still well used. There was some good information provided on how to use self-access, and the extended opening hours for some people have been particularly beneficial. Libraries have been better for quieter study during smart hours. This has provided us a quieter space, particularly for students. And in addition, new people have joined the library, and customers have more ownership of the space, they've told us, feeling trusted to make use of the space without staff. Some of the concerns reflected has been around something that we probably knew was going to happen, which is a tailgating, people following somebody in. But we've done some other work looking at other authorities about this issue, and I think we've felt that we've done more than other authorities in terms of trying to ensure that doesn't happen. But it's not reflected in any particular spikes in incident reporting, I don't think. So on balance, I think we feel that the first 6 months of the operation has been positive. Overall performance has remained stable, and we've put in place some robust mitigating measures to ensure public safety have kept incidents at low levels. We have had a mixed response. Obviously, some people much prefer that we put staff there, but clearly, we've always said that we really have to use technology to operate the service in different ways. And it has enabled us to increase the access opening hours of those libraries, as we said, by some 94%. 21% of active users has registered for Smart membership in that first 6 months. And we're conscious that looking at more current figures, that's increased to around 25% currently. But we do know that there's further work to be done after as we approach the first year of bedding in to communicate the benefits of Smart Library membership, and that will be built into our service planning for the next year. So happy to take any questions.
Mr. Parton.
Could I ask about the number 34, where it talks about lack of toilet facilities? What's the proposal to provide toilet facilities during unstaffed hours?
Toilet facilities for people with disabilities have a radar key, and they can use those. We're not providing toilet facilities currently because our experience of, even during staffed hours, that sometimes they can be misused in terms of what goes on in there. So I think we've been very conscious at this stage to reduce that. We haven't had lots of complaints about the toilet facilities, and certainly we're providing it for people probably in most need.
And then the next question is regarding the 24 incidents that have been recorded. What have we had any complaints at all regarding antisocial behaviour regarding computer use, or people bringing their own PCs in and perhaps trying to access material of an inappropriate nature?
Not massively. People can bring their own laptops in because we're Wi-Fi, all of the libraries are Wi-Fi generated. We can't necessarily control everything that people potentially look at when they bring their own laptops in. Certainly we have had, since we've provided access to computers, software that restricts access to certain sites, but that's an ever-changing process. It's an ever-changing landscape as new sites are created. So it is an ongoing battle in terms of that. In terms of the reporting, I should say that the CCTV monitoring is live monitoring whilst it's open all the while. And we do have somebody, a small team here in County Hall, that looks at each library, and there's the facility for them to speak to people in the library from County Hall if they feel or suspect that something untoward has happened. I have to say that hasn't happened as yet, but we do feel that we've got the processes in place. Where we have had incidents where perhaps people have fallen asleep or whatever, the processes have kicked in that alarms have been raised. We've gone in and let people out. Possibly not. But we have had the processes, and we're confident that those are working effectively at the moment.
And then the final question is, point 35, formal complaints have been minimal, with 14 recorded in the first 6 months of operation. How many of those have been upheld?
In terms of whether complaints about our service, I think in the majority of these have been about things that have happened in the library, so it's enabled us to sort of take further action, whether that's been identifying somebody and restricting their access, for example, by, we would say, if something's happened there, depending on what the incident is, we may restrict their access to Smart libraries, but they would still be able to use the staffed hours. They're not necessarily complaints, to my understanding, that have been about service provision per se. It's been about incidents that we felt that we have to monitor because of the just keeping abreast of the health and safety.
All right, that was a point of clarification. Thank you.
Mr. Mayor.
I welcome this report, actually. I think this is the way to go. A few years ago, 5 or 6 years ago, we were closing libraries or reducing hours, and now we're going to 100% opening hours, or increasing, I should say. But I think we haven't got there yet with the technology, and the amount of hours that we're open, but also the amount of people that are enrolled onto the Smart Library. And there's two points I wanted to make. One, I think the enrolment process from normal library card user to an Smart Library card user is cumbersome. You have to do an online tutorial, agree, and then you have to go into the library and see a member of staff who will then finish that enrolment and give you a 4-digit PIN number so you can access the library. And I think that could be done seamlessly in one go online, and it generates one, because then people can access the library. And I use myself an example. I did the online tutorial. I still haven't been inside the library yet during staffed hours to be able to access it. And it is frustrating because you see the amount of hours it's open, but also the amount of people that have enrolled. I think it would have been a bit higher by now because the amount of staffed hours are very restrictive, and I think people have migrated to staffed hours because I've seen when staff are there so they can access the library without smart facilities. And I think if we can get more people to come in when it's unstaffed, and then the usage will get better. And also the opening hours. And I'm only using Loughborough Library as an example. Loughborough Library is open from 8 a.m. to 7 p.m. as all the smart hours, and it's staffed in between. But on a Wednesday, for example, it's all smart, so there are no staff there. But then on a Sunday, on a weekend, when a lot of parents have got the children and all the rest of it, is the library's closed. And I don't understand why, where everything is 24-hour shopping and all the rest of it, that we still close our libraries when we've got smart facilities on a Sunday. And potentially maybe we could include a Sunday opening hour, not 8 till 7, but a shorter period where people can go in smart and use the library facilities during the day. And that's the points I wanted to make. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, just a few comments about that. Yes, obviously a lot of work's taken place to sort of establish the system. I think sort of as we approach the end of the first year, we've seen that as a sort of like a bedding in. We did discuss Sunday opening hours as part of this, and it's our sort of plan for the next phase, although it will likely incur some additional revenue costs in terms of the monitoring during that space. I should, just as a point of interest, major libraries were open on a Sunday, sort of in years past. But when we constantly looked at, sort of usage figures and where places were most used, Sunday was its very lowest. But certainly take the point that, we have been discussing that. There's a small operational group that monitors and is really making plans for the future. So we really look at how we sort of enable that to happen. It will depend on probably some additional, or need to find some additional revenue to pay the CCTV monitoring costs during that time. But sort of in the past we've opened from sort of 10 till 3, something like that, on a Sunday, and it's probably likely that we would be able to do that. Of course, it opens up the opportunity for bank holiday times as well. So those are things that I think we wanted to, before we made those decisions, we just wanted to take some time to look at how the operation's bedded in first. Take the point about the clunkiness of the online. We are looking at making that seamless. I think the reason we were quite conservative in the first instance in terms of making sure that people were fully inducted, because of all the queries about health and safety, and there aren't any staff there, so how do we ensure that that's happened? I think we have been quite innovative in terms of having the process online, but it's just that next step now, so that you don't actually have to come in. You can get a generated PIN and then use it from there. So we are looking at that and what we'll need to do to make that happen.
Mrs. Seaton.
Thank you, Chair. My question really, my inquiry is to do with the communities libraries. Obviously, I don't know how many years ago it was now, but I'm from Thurmaston, and we built our own community library. Is there any possibility of a community library using the smart facilities in the future? I know there's a cost involved, but obviously they would contribute to that.
Obviously, you're right. There is a cost in terms of installing the equipment. At the moment, the answer to that is no. But it's sort of certainly something that you do think about. We've had a lot of comments about, well, if a community managed library sort of couldn't be operated in any other way, could it be a standalone smart library? I think we'll have to sort of consider that bridge when we come to it, because obviously there is a considerable capital cost in terms of installing the equipment and so forth. So at the moment, it's not something that we're seeing as a priority at this point, but that's not to say it's not off the table either.
Thank you. I should imagine, though, those initial costs, the community libraries could go up funding for the initial costs to do that. But I can only speak to the one at Thurmaston. There's been quite a few occasions where it's difficult to get volunteers, and volunteers obviously go down ill, they go on holidays, and to get that coverage as well, it would be very helpful if, say, 1 day a week could be a smart library. So it would probably be good to be able to cost that out and see if they could go for funding for it, though.
Yeah, we've got an idea of per library how much it would cost. I can't tell you that at the moment, but I think the other point worth making as well is that those obviously those groups that run the community libraries are independent bodies, so we're not in a position necessarily where we would want to say, well, you need to do this or that. It would be down to any community group that we're looking at, sort of thinking of that. We could certainly help them in terms of sort of brokering with our technology supplier, but the funding of it, sort of, I guess, would be down to them to raise the money as things stand at the moment. Yeah.
All right, thank you, Nigel. And in view of the comments in the report, I'd like to thank all members and officers for staying wide awake today, not dozing off. That's the next meeting will be on the 8th of June 2020 at 2 p.m. And as there are no urgent items, I close today's meeting and thank you all for your attendance.